So, welcome back to Ethics TV, everyone. I'm Jonathan, and today I'm also joined by another Jonathan with an extra H in the first four letters, the first three letters, which, by the way, always confuses people when they're writing my name. They tend to write it in the way that your name is. And I'm consistently removing H's, which I feel now slightly embarrassed for, bearing in mind I'm speaking to one with an H. Um, but, but Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you. You have the opposite problem of me. Everybody keeps leaving out the H, so we need to switch people who are contacting us.
There you go. That's what it is. That's the solution to it all. So, so I mean, your description is in the bio, in your bio is in the description even, and so anyone who wants to get some backstory, there's that. But with someone with a life as varied as yours, it's hard to know where to start, other than what is keeping you busy right now.
Um, a lot of things keep me busy right now. Primarily, it's the running of my family's. I'm third generation running a family business, Symbiont Inc. Uh, Inside of Symbiont, just dealing with the day to day. But recently, we've embarked, if you will, on a artificial intelligence hub of sorts for small business owners and executives. So that's been keeping me really busy in the different solutions that are going to be in there and that have been developed and testing them and retesting them and just killing them as much as we can on the inside before we release to the public. So that's the main thing.
On that AI side, is the AI for small business aspects using, and this is not anything like where I was going to ask you next in the progress of things, but my interest is piqued. The are you uh, using other AI platforms in solutioning a kind of an architecture for small businesses, or advising them how best to use AI?
We're doing both, right? So first start is advising. So for the last over a year, we've been talking with a lot of small and medium-sized businesses about AI, what it means to them, doing a couple of trial pilots, if you will, with them, trying to get, see how they feel about it and how it's working for them. We've had some successes, but the biggest thing is that came back to me was there are a lot of tools that we've come across that practically every business owner or executive has said, "Hey, I need something like this," or "I want something like this." So instead of making individual solutions, if you will, which we can and do, we are looking at making a more generic type of a hub so companies could pay for a monthly subscription and be able to use these tools as they need them.
Awesome. Wow. Well, that's really cool, and that's a whole separate conversation we need to have then, because I'm creating self dot app, which is a private AI, completely sovereign AI that can be
Okay.
used by businesses. So yeah, we'll talk about we'll talk about
Yes,
that
yes,
offline.
I really do
Um,
want to talk about that. Yes.
okay, cool. That's really good. And so, what I noticed when I was researching you and looking into your background, there is this obvious thread of ethics throughout everything you've done. Uh, well, I don't know that from the Navy background side, it kind of goes Navy, software, church. But I've seen a thread anyway, to me, that there's either a progression into increasingly ethical directions, or there always has been ethics in your life in some way. And how has that webbed in? How's that fitted?
So even though you see the Navy and you think automatically, oh, there's no ethics there, but maybe
Oh,
afterwards. But actually, it was the Navy that really got me really interested around ethics. The interesting thing about my time in the Navy is the role that I did, the job that I did. We were at the as they say, the tip of the spear, and so therefore I was making recommendations and other tactical type of recommendations to command and control. But when you're making those recommendations, it's not cut and dry a lot of times. You have to look at several different variables to come up with a conclusion so you could make that recommendation and all. So I would think that the ethics really started there. of understanding, laws, rules, regulations, um, how things are supposed to be done, what's the purpose of what we're doing, and things like that. A lot of people think about the military, they think it's just people taking a bunch of orders. However, the military does have a mechanism in it for you to question, to ask and delve and get more information that a lot of people don't realize or don't see. You'll see the movies where it's like everybody's just going in and fighting, but you don't realize everything that went before that. So I think that was the start of it. And specifically, I can remember a commanding officer who had a degree in philosophy, which I thought at the time was unusual. But sometimes he would come into CIC where I worked, or he'd be on the bridge, and he would just say things, just little sentences here and there that really made you think. Like before you said something to him, he would say something, and then it would trigger like, hmm. Well, sir, let me go back and look at this really quickly, and then let me come back to you. Now, once I got out of the Navy, it was over 30 years practically in IT. I started noticing things because when I came out of the Navy back in the 90s, when we started using computers more, and there was the big push at the time of, oh, computers are going to take away our jobs, right? Make us all redundant. Um, Looking at the programs and how they were being used, even though I was junior, it still made me think, is this the right thing? Are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? How is this, how are we aligning things? One of the things that I really applaud about the IT industry was it started getting us out of the mold of everybody doing the same thing and started allowing a lot more diversification of thought and of processes and getting things done differently. Therefore, when you look at certain platforms back then, they were very much like this. They were, do you have to do this, press this button? We're talking mainframes, right? If you didn't do it this way, it didn't work, kind of a thing. But if you look at PCs, they started really progressing around being customizable, where you didn't necessarily have to follow these steps. You had to follow this process, but these steps you could change around. And that was able to make it more open, I guess, to more people. And as I progressed up and got into software development, I think the biggest thing that hit me in the face, if you will, quite literally almost, was when you're developing software, you work with a team of developers and a whole project team, and looking around the table, some of the consumer software that I worked with, for instance, you'd say, yeah, that works for that use case,
Mm.
but you're trying to sell it to everybody. And I
Mm.
know this use case, it doesn't work, right? So, of course, being a mid-level around that time, it was pretty much shut up and code, get it done.
Yeah.
But I started looking at, I need to advance because I want to be in those decisions,
Mm.
seats and rooms, so I can steer that conversation of, hey, what about this group? What about this use
Mm.
case? What about these
Mm.
other things? You do realize that by taking this software in this direction, you've just cut out a big portion of people. So for me, ethics was around that. There's been projects before, which I won't bore you with, but there have been projects before where I've had a firm stance like, no, this is not good tech. It's not going to work well, and it's going to, even if it did work well, it's going to suppress people, or it's going to malign a lot of people, and it's not good, in my opinion, not good tech. And
Yeah.
we need to, either back away from this tech. And in one instance, I said, I went to city councils and I said, you need to back off of this tech. Don't use it because it's not good, and it's
Yeah.
going to cause more problems than anything.
Mm.
The pastoral side, that was something from youth. My mom always wanted me to be a minister, even though I ran away from it for years and years and all. But as I got older and started really looking back, I looked at my life and I said, even though I may not have been a very religious person, I always was a religious person on the inside. It was I never did anything bad or anything, but it was, and I didn't carry a Bible in the workspace with me, but it was always something in the back of my head of, hey, in my belief, there's a higher person than me, and I need to be sure that I can stand in front of them properly.
Mm.
And I think that's when really I started getting into more philosophy, like that commanding officer, and also just religious texts and trying to understand, me as a person. What am I here for? Right? What's my purpose in life, kind of a thing. And in the end, I came up with, I've managed to build myself up into, uh, some people call me a thought leader, and I need to use that platform to start advocating for ethical tech. Right now, it's ethical AI. What are we doing with this? Where'd that data come from? Who's it going to impact? I understand it's got good benefits, but what are the bad benefits side of it too? Um, and I think that comes from my risk tolerance too as a business owner.
Mm.
It's like, if this goes wrong, how
Mm.
wrong can it be? And are you okay with that?
Yeah, is the juice worth the squeeze? Um,
Exactly.
it's interesting, isn't it? Because there are some people who would imagine that ethical technology as a subject is either now new or growing, or and I do wonder whether the application of ethical principles into tech is really something that could be new, or whether it always has been in place. It's just maybe that, I mean, I interviewed a guy called Morris um, at the beginning of Ethics TV, who said that engineering as a topic didn't have ethics as a module. Um, and that's why a lot of things were built through the decades that didn't necessarily think about the humane consequences, or the principles, or even the morals behind things. And but one could also say that if there's humans involved in building stuff, then there's naturally ethics involved in it anyway, because the humans themselves have some form of principles, or lack of principles. Either way round, it's a spectrum of ethics. So, where I was, what I was going to kind of ask you is, what's the crossover between your personal and professional life? But it's almost an asked and answered question, in the fact that they are one in the same. Someone has things they stand for, and then they apply those things to what they do.
Mhm.
Um, and but from the journey into the pastoral position, did you feel that changed the way that you viewed technology, or did did it actually, did you kind of always, as you say, it was on the inside, your relationship with God was on the inside anyway, and
Mhm.
so it never really adjusted your principles, it just outwardly platformed them in a different way? I mean, you see where I'm going with
Yeah,
that.
I would say that when I did my journey on the pastoral journey side of things, to be honest with you, tech scared me. Um, I look at it and I'm like, I hope we're not getting to the point to where we think we are God, you know. And I keep my eye out on that. I'm looking very deeply at the AGI that they're talking about developing, and I look very closely at what we're doing with cloning and
Mm.
um, trying to make life, if you will. And I'm like, are we playing with something we shouldn't be playing with, that we don't understand? Um, I would say I agree with the earlier speaker, as a topic in engineering, no, there was no ethics thing. I think up to this point, it kind of got built in, right? Everybody has some kind of a code that they live by. And there's just certain tech that, although there has been bad tech and bad innovations that have released, in the past, we've been able to, squelch them pretty quickly, like, oh, pull that away, can't do that type of a thing. And I don't like to use this term, but we had before what we call the democratization of technology, right? You had certain companies and boards of directors, and they were kind of like the gatekeepers.
Mhm.
There was just certain, I mean, yes, we've seen some bad stuff, but there's a lot of stuff that never made it out, right? They
Yeah.
said keep it in the lab, throw it away, burn all the
Yeah.
documents, don't talk about this ever
Yeah.
again. And that kind of was a bit of a safety force as well. But now with the democratization of technology, different cultures, different beliefs, and I don't want to get on a pulpit here, but now more people have access to do things that before were controlled
Mm.
somewhat, right? So, for instance, I thought it was very interesting a few years ago when drones first started coming out. We had the drones; they were fun, right? People flying around, taking pictures, and then one day somebody decides to mount a weapon on one,
Mm.
right? And people are like, whoa, I'm not so sure we like that idea, right? And from a consumer perspective, that kind of got squelched. We know that the military uses it and all, but they're using it in certain use cases and all. And we hope that they have ethical people who are determining that their usage and all. But the commercial side of it, the consumer side, we said we don't want that. We don't need that, and it kind of got squelched. I have been reading lately that that's starting to come back to a certain extent, and I again use my platform is to try to call out and say, hey, do you all realize, look at the long term, where this is going to go? Um, are you okay with that long term feeling? If we're not, then that's something we do need to step back from and put some things in place to hold it back. But
Yeah.
mhm.
How much do you think that the companies that are creating, let's say, AGI experiments, um, how much do you think they consider consequence in the way that you are?
To be honest with you, not much.
No.
If you look at the major players in trying to get to AGI, they're all for-profit organizations, right?
Mm.
Being led by for-profit people. So therefore, they're always going to look at the profit side of things. And so I don't think they really think about it that much. They're looking at getting the market as fast as possible so they can make money off of it. I think it's going to be up to people like myself, people like yourself, and the people you're speaking with. We're going to have to be the ones to be that canary in the coal mine of letting, hey, look, this is what the tech does. This is what's happening with it. Are you, the consumer, okay with that? Right? Because even though the for-profit companies are big behemoths, at the end of the day, they are subordinate to the consumer. If you decide not to buy it, if we decide we're not going to buy your tech, hey, it's great, it looks awesome, but we don't want it. Well, that kills that project, right? How many
Yeah.
consumer products have we seen get destroyed just because the consumer says we don't want it, you
Yeah.
know? But also, barring that happening, the next best thing is to also be the ones to talk to the legislatures and the rule makers and the policymakers of, hey, here's some guardrails, or here are things that you need to think about and things that you need to do. At the end of the
Mm.
day, you know, do you want this to happen to you? If it goes terribly wrong, would you want to be on the other side of it being wrong? Kind of a
Mm.
thing. And making sure that those get in place. I'm very encouraged by what's happening in the EU with regards to AI. I think they are really starting to take a lead in ethical AI and its usage. America, where my country is, it looks like we're starting to wake up a little bit to it. I know that the coming election, that is one of the topics. So that's going to be very interesting to see how that all plays out.
There's a there's a spectrum of opinion on restriction with Nick Bostrom on one end, warning of the existential crisis that new technology presents. And then on the other end is the Mark Andreessen from Andreessen Horowitz, who is of the school of thought, and this is me super paraphrasing, and anyone watching this who or listening to this who knows how far I'm probably misquoting, please do accept my apologies in advance, but would feel that restrictions are bad. Legislation, regulation is the enemy of innovation. And the argument for that, if I was to steelman that, is that we can't find new ways of doing things unless we make stuff and break stuff. So if we are restricted, then our opportunity or our aperture for innovation is reduced. On the other side of the spectrum, um, it's not, I believe, too far-fetched to have a relatively good steer on what a scenario could play out like and pre-police that scenario um, in advance without necessarily restricting innovation. Um, uh, and let's take consumer drones, for instance. If it were to be the case that consumer drones could carry the handgun license that someone in America could have, and you end up with consumer drones that are armed, we know that we don't need to restrict innovation to know what the outcome of that could be. So so but on the other side, the steelman argument of kind of, restriction legislation reduces innovation, um, that argument would seem to present the thing of like, well, let's let it happen and see what happens. And I'm catastrophizing and probably oversimplifying that to make a point and a very devil's advocate point. But do you feel that there are some consequences and scenarios that are so simple to consider that we wouldn't be restricting innovation to put guardrails in place in advance?
I would say, we need guardrails. The thought process of, regulations are bad and they're going to restrict innovation. I think that's almost a scorched earth approach to things. That's almost saying, well, just let chaos reign,
Yeah.
right? And once it happens, then we can start. No, once you let that genie out of the bottle, it's out and you can't put it back in. I would counter argue, and I know Mr. Horowitz from his readings, and I know he's a very influential person, but I would also argue that restrictions actually encourage innovation. If we think back to the 70s, right, we had the oil crisis. Couldn't get gas, couldn't do anything. After the 70s, we realized, hey, this natural fuels, it's not infinite. It's a finite supply. So what does that started, right? Because we realized, look, we're running out of fuel, right? We've started coming with alternative fuels, right? Electric cars, wind power, wave power. We've started looking at technology and developing technology in areas that literally 50 years ago we weren't even looking at. We didn't really care about. I think the only wind power we had was windmills. That was only because it was a necessity back in ancient medieval times. So I do believe that there is a very fine line between being overly restrictive and just letting chaos reign. We have to make sure we're maneuvering that properly. And one of the biggest things we have to realize is, first of all, as a culture, what are our beliefs? What are we comfortable with? It's interesting, when we talk about handguns in America. I read something the other day that, America is like 5% of the population of the world, yet we own half the guns,
Wow.
and in the world. And I don't know how true that was. It's something I read really fast, but I was like, wow, but different countries have gun ownership and they don't have the problems that we have.
Mm.
But if you look at what are their laws around guns and control and things like that, vastly different than what we have over here in America. And now I think we are getting to a point to where a serious conversation is being had about that. The same is going to happen with AI, except the problem with AI, it knows no boundaries. It knows there's no country. It doesn't respect countries. It doesn't respect territories. I'm in several AI groups where it's everybody from around the world, different cultures, different religions, different everything, and we're using it and we're talking about it and we're developing things and all. Unlike, something like we were talking about with handguns, that can be restricted by country. So you could have a system that was built in one country being used in another country that is biased against a certain population, but in this one country it's okay because that's not an
Mm.
issue they have to deal with. But over here in this other country, it is an issue. So we're gonna have to start thinking about that as a, I don't know, a world culture now of, well, what are we as a world going to be acceptance and tolerant of? And are we comfortable with these decisions as a whole? That's going to be a
Mm.
very interesting conversation because, up to now, I can't think of a time in the world history that we've all agreed on something, you
No.
know. So it's going to be
No.
very interesting.
Although interestingly, historically, the times when we could all agree on something are the disastrous times when something really calamitous goes wrong, and then people club together. In the Second World War in the
Yeah.
UK, for instance, is the time when my parents speak of my father was growing up as a child during the Second World War, and how he speaks of community spirit whilst watching your neighborhood being completely decimated is beyond politics, beyond media, beyond, there is a collective um, feeling. It's kind of at the base level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs moment, where it's food, shelter. It's like these things,
Hmm.
and and I'm wondering whether the it is the lack of an overarching or an underpinning fundamental principle or set of principles that is causing these risks. And even in the name artificial intelligence, one of the things I note is that what it means is artificial logical intelligence, not necessarily artificial emotional intelligence.
None.
And what's more so, could emotions be artificial, bearing in mind that's energy in motion? And more so than that, is it then too simplistic to say that it is the lack of any form of faith in these things that means that they are unlikely to be guided in ways that are good?
2 points. The first part about World War II, very good example. What I was talking about with artificial intelligence and tech, though, is the world, right? So even though the UK, Australia, United States bound together, you got to remember on the other side, the Axis didn't agree. They thought, hey, that's great what you're doing to London. We're going to win this war. So we never, like I said, we never had a worldwide, not that I can remember,
Mm,
we all were like of one mind,
good point.
this direction we need to go in. Right?
Good point.
Now, as far as artificial intelligence is concerned, you bring up a very good point. It is artificial logical intelligence. It has no emotion to it. The computer has no emotion whatsoever. Even if I programmed an AI that said it cared and it answered, it still has no emotion to it at all. It's going to look at whatever its algorithm is set for,
That's right.
right? So the emotion, if I can use that word, is in the algorithm. It's in what do we put in that algorithm to
Mm,
say these are no-go areas. I just did an article on LinkedIn where I talked about, what if somebody invented a AI system that effectively routed traffic in your city? You never had to worry about traffic jams ever again. But when you looked at it, you saw that it's sending most of the traffic, the majority of the traffic, through low-income neighborhoods, right? There's no traffic. However, now what are you doing in those low-income neighborhoods by sending tens of thousands of cars and trucks through it, right? What's their quality of life going to be like? Those are questions we have to think about, and that's got to be put in the algorithm of, hey, just because that's the most expedient route or it has the fastest way to get through the city,
mm,
we got to put something in there. No more than X amount of cars can go through there at any given time, or
mm,
what have you. But if we leave it to the computer to say, "Hey, you told me to find the fastest route to keep the traffic down. I'm going to do that," and it just happens to mean to go through that. So I would like to think that in the future, when it comes to working with these algorithms and training these algorithms, that we are putting some emotion behind it. We're starting to say, hey, this is some things to think about, some things we need to have part of that equation. But also, again, I have to go back to the consumer. You know, if I am a city planner or a city manager and this software is sent to me, it's my responsibility to see, well, how is it doing routing? What does that look like? I can't just employ it and say, hey, I got rid of all the traffic. I'm the
Mm,
number one planner. No, that's not acceptable. I have to still be able to go in and on my individual level say, hey, look, your solution is not working for my city. I don't care if it worked for 20 other cities. It doesn't work for us because we don't like the way it's routing through the low income neighborhoods.
mm,
So and that's the other thing too. That's what one of the things that scares me about AGI. AI right now, specifically generative AI, is very primitive. If you really think about it, this is back. I mean, you have a background in computers. This is back in the DOS days, right? When you can write something on a script and it'll run and like, oh, but that was very primitive right now. Now you don't have to do all that. The same is true, when you go to any of the LLMs, you're basically looking at a prompt, you're
yeah.
typing a long prompt and you're getting back your response. But the thing that's good that about it is because it's primitive, it requires human input. It requires
Mm,
us to, you could start with for the prompt, oh, that's not good enough. I need to change that. Oh, I didn't like this. I need to change this type of a thing. But when you get to AGI, that's when you're talking about the computer operating by itself
mm,
and it doesn't need us. It just says, tell me what you want me to do and I will do it. I'll figure it out type of a thing. And it may do a really good job. And this brings it back to my Navy days. Without going too much into the tech, there is a system that they use, and I know other countries have it now. It's called the Aegis Destroyer. The Aegis Destroyer has been around for decades. It was designed to operate autonomously, where it can locate, track, make firing solutions, and even fire weapons all by itself. All by itself. I was trained on how to use that system. I can tell you, when I was in the military, never did I ever see us actually do it. We may have turned it on just for a minute, just for a test, to do a test or something, but we never sailed with that in full auto. And the reason for that was we realized, yeah, it's really good at what it does, but if it makes a mistake, it
mm,
could be devastating, right? Especially if you have certain types of munitions on that ship that it has control of. So the same is true when you start talking about AI, AGI. I'm like, yeah, it can do it, but should we do it? A quote I like to use, especially when it comes to AI, is from my favorite movie, Jurassic Park, and it was Jeff Goldblum's character. And when they was getting the tour of the lab, and he was horrified, basically, and they said, "Your scientists or whatever, your scientists were so busy with answering the question, could they do something, that nobody ever stopped to ask, should we do that?"
that's right.
Right. And that's where when we get to tech and the modern world, that's where I think we really need to start pumping the brakes. Like, hey, do we, yes, that's great. You have an algorithm that can do X, Y, and Z. Awesome. But we don't need to go any farther than that. You
Yeah.
know, we have had, I've read papers where there have been scientists and experts who said, hey, here's a tech, but it should never leave the laboratory,
Yeah.
only because this is A, it's not good tech, or B, this will be abused. We can
Yeah.
show you how to abuse it right here, right now, and all. And I guess from a higher level thinking, sometimes in my spiritual thinking, I get to the point where I'm saying, just because we can do something, should we do it? But also, we should be thinking, if I had to answer somebody at the end of my life, if I had to stand in front of somebody to answer for my life, could I justify it?
Mm,
Could I justify making that decision? Even
mm,
though, and no. And I also like to think that a lot of people don't realize the dangers of some of this technology. And so part of our job is to say, hey, you should look at this. This is
mm,
what this means. Yes, it does A, B, and C, but did you also know it also does X, Y, and Z?
mm,
Are you okay with that decision? And
yeah.
I would like to still put my faith in the human nature of we would make the right call overall, but I
Mm.
don't know.
I think the it's interesting because the the reason why I use the World Wide War uh, example of the communities in London, specifically in my father's perspective,
Hmm.
coming together was to make a micro metaphor of what would make potentially the world come together, and that would be a catastrophic global disaster. This, if you zoom out of a neighborhood in London and imagine that the neighborhood in London is the world, and
Hmm.
imagine that the warplanes sent over the channel is actually a set of technologies that literally or figuratively turn the lights off en
Tornado.
masse. Yeah.
Tornadoes.
So then one could argue that the world could come together
Oh yeah.
um, in a shared survival requirement. Um, but another way, I guess, would be if the world had a unified belief that wasn't disparate in its ambitions.
Hmm.
Um, but then to even think, let alone instruct that, could be arguably taking away the sovereignty of each individual's uh, agency of how they believe and how they operate. Um, and I've always wondered about this because on one perspective, some of the super religious people that I've met have been the loveliest, kindest people, however they believe. For instance, let's take it from the Catholic side. Um, I've sat in a Catholic church and heard the repetition that there is only one God and it's a Catholic God.
Hmm.
And then I've asked the people in the church, and so what about if someone has a different version? And they go, well, they are lost and they will hopefully find their way.
Hmm.
I've spoken to Jewish pastors who feel that there is obviously one version and there's no son of, there's no there's no structure that
Hmm.
this Bible that you call the Bible is not actually the Bible. There's these Dead Sea Scrolls that are fundamentally different, and but then I've also spoken to people from Islam who can argue extremely convincingly
Oh yeah.
that there is there's a structure that just that is ignored by the Western religions. So so to enable people to have different beliefs seems to be at odds with a particular thesis that could be if everyone believed in one thing and that one thing was agreed on, that there was that these are the principles, this is what it is, and at the end of the day this is what this is what we're living for, and these are the principles by, then things would be easier. And then on the other hand, again, on a third perspective, is it not the case that all religions kind of have a similar and in historical terms, it's called the axial age of several thousand years ago, where it seems that Eastern and Western thought processes all kind of had a similar monomyth, a similar story arc, where there is a kind of, and for instance, every single religious script speaks of some form of flood.
Hmm.
And and historians would argue that there was indeed at least one, if not two, cataclysmic melted ice cap, like wipe out most of the world type floods. And almost every, if not every, religious script has some form of deity that is greater than us, that is higher than us, that is whatever. Some of them personify it in a figurative way, and others keep that esoteric. But nonetheless, so there are similes across these religions. And I often with paradoxes, there's no yes and no's, there's only balances in answers. But where do you sit on any of those points from I mean, this is obviously way off what I was thinking we were going to talk about, but we're talking exactly what we need to talk about. Um, so where do you sit on those balances?
I've studied multiple religions, and you're right. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of same storylines that come from that seem to be coming from one source, and I always thought about at some point we started just drifting off and latching onto our own tribes and beliefs and things like that. But you hit at something that I consider is very fundamental. When I talk about the world, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean my belief is the better belief or your belief is a better belief or there's one religion or what have you. I think we need to look at it from a even more fundamental perspective of just life as ourselves. As human beings, what do we value? The core of it. Well, we want to stay alive. We want to continue our species. We want to live in a society that we are um, free to breathe, right? So if we can get back to the just the bare basics, and to use your example, Maslow's, right? Get to the bare basics of that, then it doesn't really matter what religion you are or what your belief system is. It's as long as we all believe that, hey, no matter your religion, no matter what your belief is, you have a right to live,
Hmm.
right? And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you live, just like you're going to do everything you can to make sure I live. And that if we can get to that level, then when we start talking about AI and other topics like that, then it starts coming around full circle of, okay, is this challenging our fundamental belief of is this going to destroy our species? It's funny, the only time that you ever see us as a world get together is on the science fiction movies when the aliens are coming and they're under attack, or you have Terminator, right? All the humans, we all band together, right? And we're,
Right.
we're like fighting just survive, and unfortunately in the movies, I hope we never have to get to that point where it's us against some greater being, or even, I growing up, I used to like the Terminator movies. I don't know why,
Hmm.
but I just loved them, right? But we ended up making a mistake. We made it so that there are robots with AGI that can reproduce, and now they're fighting us because they've realized, humans, you are the problem, right? You're destroying this earth, and we're going to take care of the problem because that's how we were programmed. And I would hope that we are not trying to design systems like that are going to destroy us. Just like in the movies, right? Whenever you're dealing with AI or autonomous being, they always have this golden law, right? You cannot hurt humans,
Hmm.
right? Kind of a thing. Maybe we have to get to that level, but first, I think we need to get away all the clutter, and I put religion in there too. Get that away and say, what is our core belief right now? What do we believe in as a whole? And I think we can, if we have that conversation, we could have that. Now, obviously, we have not had that conversation yet because
Hmm.
we see wars every day. We see the hurting of people, and people are not here today that were here yesterday. That's occurring. So we still have not had that basic conversation. And before we can have that, or before we go with AI and talk about going towards AGI, I think that conversation should be had first. I doubt it will happen because, like I said earlier, the people making the tech, the companies making that stuff, they're full steam ahead, you know,
Hmm.
and there's nothing to stop them from saying we'll do what we're going to
Yeah.
do.
Do you think that the US Constitution is an example of overarching principles that are beyond or not requiring a certain religious um, uh, thesis because it's the constitution of being a human in America? Is that an example of an overarching system?
It could be, but there are some parts of the Constitution that are troubling. You know, I don't think the Constitution would work great for the entire world. America's Constitution would work for the entire world. That would just make everybody American, right? I believe that we're going to have to come up with some kind of a world constitution where we all can get together and say, this is us as a world, what we believe in. Um, for example, in the American Constitution, you have the right to guns, and that's not something that's in every country, and not every country wants that. So therefore, to say, oh, let's use the American Constitution or use Great Britain's or Australia's or whoever's, that I think is too limiting. And we really need to have a conversation because there are cultural differences and other things that we have to take into account when we start
Mm.
talking about that.
And if there were to be a world constitution, um, who would author that? There's a in the Icelandic constitution, they crowdsourced it from the public, and in a Reddit style thumbs up, thumbs down, the what got written into the constitution was the most suggested aspects. Would no, again, this I'm going from extremes across the spectrum to show the breadth here. But on one hand, we've got crowdsourcing a worldwide constitution from 8 billion people. Well, of course, 1% will care to do so. The rest will think that it's pointless. But
Exactly.
there's so perhaps a cynical viewpoint, but I'm over
Oh,
50, so I'm starting to become a grumpy old man.
I'm right there with you. I'm right there with you.
So, so there's a crowdsourced version on one end of the spectrum, and the other end of the spectrum, there's uh, a, a, a small group of people who create a worldwide constitution and then rally support for it. Where, if there were to be a worldwide constitution, who, who and how would that be authored?
That's a good question. And I don't have a ready answer. You brought
Nor do
out,
I.
right? 1% would probably fill it out. How do we guarantee everybody gets a say? Every I can't say, oh, well, just each country or each
Mm,
province or whatever is going to elect somebody. No, that you're going to take one person to represent 300 million people in America, for instance, and I know in America we're all over the place, on the spectrum of, so it's like good luck finding one person to represent all of us. And then what are you going to do if there's a debate, if there is a problem, right? I want the right to a gun. I don't want the right to the gun. Fifty
yeah,
fifty. What are we going to do?
that's
Right?
right.
You can't flip a coin on that. So maybe this conversation is almost fantasy, but something has to be done.
Mm.
Um, we need to get to something that we can all say, I agree to this. And but I don't know if that's even possible
No,
because
and nor do I. I mean, what I do, however, think is if we take Asimov's law of robotics that you referred to, um, and the three laws for those who are watching or listening, just to be clearer, the first Asimov's in iRobot, the book that people think that it's a Will Smith concept, but but the Asimov's books are important to read. But a robot may not injure or harm a human being through inaction or a human being to come to harm. The second is that a robot must obey orders given to it by humans, except where such orders would conflict the first law. And the third is a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first and second law. And I do think that, well, currently at the time of recording in September 2024, and my thoughts every day adjust themselves. I think when you stop learning, you stop growing. So at the moment, in September 2024, my view is that there are things like that that are highly likely that the world would agree to en masse. If you said to 8 billion people, if you managed to get to 8 billion people and asked everyone and everyone had to answer, do you think it's important that robots shouldn't create harm to human beings? The only people that I can imagine that would think that that is not a good idea are people who are using robots to harm human beings. And I'm of the mind at the moment, caveat included, that the majority of the world don't want to cause harm. I'm of that mindset. I think people are generally good. And I think people generally would like to go about their existence, keeping their family safe, keeping their community together, and want a peaceful, fulfilling life. I think
Yep.
generally that's what people want. And then there is a very small, however, very loud minority that don't have those principles at heart. Primarily, they're interested in dominion. And but if one were to take a poll of 8 billion, I think it would be a fractional percentage that thinks that the Asimov's law of robotics should not be implemented. And the paradox here, of course, is that to implement the law of robotics, it would take that minuscule but very loud percentage to implement them. And therein lies our issue, because to implement something like the law of robotics en masse would require governmental intervention. And the governmental intervention would need to be referred to the donors to those governments. And the donors to those governments could well be the companies that benefit largely from the destruction of others. I'm
Yes.
being
You're
um,
you're talking about the defense industrial base. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
So then after a constitution of sorts, and let's say the law of robotics were included within it, um, there would need to be some form of application of that global constitution that does not require the inclusion of the government to apply it. And so I in my fantasy of this, I see a philosophical revolution. So we had the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and then a philosophical revolution, where the whole concept of how because a religion in and of itself is arguably capitalism. And
Yeah.
capitalism has propagated greed, the greed that is within us, to be the alternate to what you're saying, which is, there are things we could do, but should we do them? What capitalism has done as a theology is said, oh no, no, you should. You should buy the extra 6 bags of chips. And you should actually buy ice cream every day.
Mhm.
Um, and and in fact there are even websites where you should have an affair, or you
Mhm.
should watch this pornography, or you should and even social media where you should doom scroll. In fact, it feels like a slot machine
Mhm.
intentionally. You scroll down and the wheel goes round, and maybe you've got some more likes. You've got the 777 on the slots. It's a dopamine tripping
Yeah.
system. So I'm hoping that there is a philosophical revolution where things that are short-term gain for long-term pain are seen for what they are, that we have installed consequence and critical thinking over um, transient titillation. That's my hope. But I think it
Yeah.
is possibly unrealistic, but that doesn't mean it's not a bad hope.
No, hope is always good. Um, I would agree with you. The only way that this global constitution, like I said, could happen, unfortunately, I believe it would take a chaotic event, something devastating to the entire world
That's my
before
point.
we all get together.
That's my point.
But I would like to avoid us as humans triggering that that event, right? So in the meantime, I'm going to use my platform to try to like raise the red flags, things like that. So we don't trigger it itself. Hey, if aliens pop up in our atmosphere one day, we didn't do that. Well, maybe we did with the SETI project where we were sending out those radio signals. I don't know. We called them to us. I don't know. But we need to make sure that we're not the ones to trigger that. man does not realize how destructive man can be.
Mm,
And I'm not a tree hugger or one of those environmentalists, but we've done some serious damage to this planet in our relatively short amount of time here and all. I'm sure the alligators look at us like we've been here far longer than you all have, and we've never came close to what you all have done to this planet. But we can do even so much more. Now, the whole Asimov's laws of robotics, it would. I was just thinking about this over the weekend because I was reading an article about military tech where they are using AI to build vehicles and other pretty, I mean, they're neat, right? Even in I look at them like, oh, that's pretty neat, type of robotic tools. And I said, well, what if one day we had a war of just the robots? They were like, they went in the middle of the desert somewhere, and they met, and then however robots were standing at the end, that country won, you know. But then you have to be very careful because, well, what'd you put in those things? Oh, well, we have a nuclear reactor in them. Oh, well, shoot, you just blew one up and now you have a nuclear dawn occurring, to the humans or something like that. That would be the only way that I could see war progressing and changing in that manner. Um, but the rules we're in an age I think of rule bending and in some cases breaking. Certain things, if you look at our history, certain things just would have never been allowed. Fighting in cities was not allowed. you know
mm.
um I like watching the old, not old, but the movies about, medieval times, in Europe, and it was always interesting, right? Whenever they had a war, they always went out to this great plain somewhere in the middle of nothing, and that's where they battled there, and then they would come dragging themselves back into town. Oh, we
Yeah.
lost or we won or what have you. But now we've seen wars change, right? It's in the cities, it's in the neighborhoods, it's and a lot of countries, unfortunately, that is just the way it is. So
Well, I think it could also be in the data. I mean, one could argue that the
in the
war is
data.
actually happening in information and in the data flow, and
Oh
one could
yeah.
also argue that it could be a clear and present danger that the tools that we are programming could be used against us. And the thing that they would use against us is the knowledge of us, which we are gleefully sharing on an ongoing
Oh
basis.
yeah. Oh
So
yeah.
we could arguably be arming a future enemy. And the irony of it all, perhaps on from a kind of a darker comedic perspective, is that um, it's like a frog in a saucepan that you gradually turn the water onto high heat versus throwing a frog into a saucepan that's boiling hot. If you do the latter, the frog jumps out. If you do the former, the frog thinks it's having a warm bath. And
Yeah.
I can't help but wonder whether there is that kind of, we're all strapped into a car that's hurtling against towards a brick wall, and we're arguing where to sit.
Yeah.
It's like sure, but equally we're can we not look at the wall and think, is this the right? Do we want to drive towards this wall? And it's like, but I want to be in the front. No, I want to be in the front. And so for people in our role, you and I, the tireless task is to accept, I guess, that this is kind of self-therapy I'm doing right now. Accept that there's a that that most may not. I see it as I call it the inertia pyramid. So there are some people that are just completely unaware of things of risk of consequence and stuff in technology. There's people who are completely unaware.
Hmm.
And then there's a group of people who are aware, but they don't know what to do about it. And then there's people who are fully aware of also what to do about it, but they have a fundamental disagreement with it and
Hmm.
therefore will not. And so in that inertia pyramid, what I think we're in the role of is enabling the unaware to become more aware and the people who are aware but not guided to be guided. And I think that's the best we can do.
Yeah. We're only human, right?
Right.
And I would add a third aspect of it of, people like us getting into the positions that can help with those decisions in the end. of saying yes, yay, nay, what have you. Um, we have freedom of thought. We have freedom of our own ways of believing things and things like that. And that is a great freedom that we have as people. But we have to think about this from the perspective of, but there does come great responsibility with that as well.
Mm.
And we can't just say whatever we want to say or do whatever we want to do. We have to realize, how does it impact? One thing about the American Constitution and American legal system that I heard once was, you have a right to do whatever you want until you start to impinge on somebody else's right,
Hmm.
you know? And so that I think is a saying to think about, especially as we go into technology and philosophy. You could believe whatever you want to believe, you could do whatever you want to do, but as soon as you start to adversely affect somebody else, well, now we got to put the brakes on you. We got to pull you back from
I'm
the
I'm
edge.
I'm of that. I actually believe that. I'm a fan of, you can believe whatever you want. If it doesn't affect anyone else's belief in whatever they want and live in their life, I I can't see any material issue with that. I have no problem
Yeah,
with that.
that's
I do have a problem when what someone believes has a material impact on the well-being of other people. I have a massive problem with that.
yes,
And so I that's something that I've always known. I think that line, there are a few things, very few absolutes in what I believe and what I think, but one of the absolutes in what I don't think it's likely that I will change my mind on that particular point.
no, I won't either. And I mean, maybe that's a fundamental that everybody, like, hey, do whatever you want to do, but don't impinge on somebody else's doing it. And unfortunately, we've seen it with religion throughout the years. They've ignored that, right? Either you're going to go with our one true God or our one true religion, or we're going to torture you, kill you, maim you.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
hold on, and that's part of, when you think about the American Constitution, everybody thinks about the freedom of religion. That's where it came from, right? Of
Mm,
Protestant, Catholic, whatever religion is, fine. We're not going to punish you for having those different religions, but don't go punishing or forcing somebody else to convert to your religion either.
hmm.
Keep it, you want to be Protestant, be happy, but we'll make sure that the Catholics won't mess with you. And the same is true on the other side too. We're not going to let you
Mm.
mess with them. So I think that, again, that goes back to the core belief, if that we had that constitution of everybody has a right to live, but until you start messing with somebody else's right to live.
Yeah.
Oh, well, okay. And the other thing, I know we've gone over a little bit, but one other thing that I think about is when we talk about AI and tech, we have to be very careful with our application of it. One thing that's very interesting is if you were to ask anybody, you're using ChatGPT 4, for instance, 4.0, I believe is the latest version. If you were to ask them, do you know what data pile or what the data is that it's drawing its information from? The vast majority of it could not tell you. And if I told them it's something called the pile, they would look at me like, what, a pile of dirt? I'm like, well, no, it's just called the pile. But you don't even know what it's called. Therefore, you don't know what's happening inside of it. You have no idea what's in it. Yes, I understand, and OpenAI and the other AI producers have all said, we don't know what happens in that black box. They literally have said, we're not sure how it comes up with its decisions. So we did an algorithm, and we cannot predict what it's going to say. And I know OpenAI and a couple others are actually having an investigation to try to figure out what's going on in that black box. But if you're a consumer and you don't even know, look, this is the data it came from, then you don't even understand, well, how was it trained? To you, it's just the dog sits. I told it to sit, he sat. You don't understand what went on behind the scenes. That becomes very dangerous, especially for leaders, because now you're starting to use technology that you don't even have a fundamental understanding how it works. So now when you start looking at some of these solutions coming out, people are like, oh wow, that's neat. And that's where people like you and me are like, oh no, it's not that neat. The output looked neat, but do you realize what it was doing its data off of, you know?
Mm.
Um, I think a couple of years ago, I'm sure you remember it, when Twitter was still Twitter, when was it Microsoft? One of the major companies released a chatbot that learned
Yep.
off of Twitter that they had to shut down like within days or like
Yep. With a day. It was
a day,
Microsoft, and the bot became a racist almost immediately, yeah, in the same day.
almost immediately. And people said, "Oh, that's terrible." But then the way I looked at it was, you know, at the time back then I used Twitter. I don't use it anymore, but I used it. But I was like, "Oh my gosh, that thing was in the deep dark side of Twitter that I never even knew existed." But there was so much data that it trained itself in a day. I mean, and you know, you and I have both worked with the way you train that data. It's like that was a lot of negative data and it got really
Absolutely.
fast. So it made
Yeah.
me look at that platform like, what's going on over there, you know? But
Yeah.
again, if we're not having those conversations about, do you understand what's going on underneath the scenes?
Mm.
Then how are you going to be able to use it in a responsible way or an ethical way? You don't even know
Mm.
how it's working, you know?
So,
So,
what you've just highlighted there is potentially a second absolute, which is the first one is do do you until you're harming someone else's doing of them. And the second absolute could well be in our future world constitution, only do stuff that you fully understand. Like play the tape to the end,
mhm,
see all the consequences, get counsel, risk assess things to the nth degree, but to as much as humanly possible, risk assess before anyone starts a run command of a line of code.
yeah.
And that could be, I would, it would be unlikely that many people would say that that's the wrong idea.
They wouldn't say it's the wrong idea, but a lot of people actually won't do it though, right? They're just looking at the output. Unfortunately, we're in this get it done fast world now, and I just want the output. I just want the output out. This looks good. This looks good. This looks good. Well, did you look at the 600 response that actually told your customer to sign off? No, I didn't. Well, that's because of the data, and it came up because you didn't understand what's going on. And
Mm,
I think that's another thing that we have to be very careful of in IT and in tech itself is, you know, for years we've always been in this world that we did this magical stuff, right? There's another saying I'm sure you've heard of, you know, you do something, technology advances so fast, or something about technology and magic. People would think it's magic, you know,
mhm,
and and what we're seeing now is no, it's not really magic, right? It's you all thought that there was all this other things. No, but with AI, we're starting to say, hey, peel it back. It's not as complicated as you think it is, or it is very complicated, but it can be explained easily, so you can understand. Hey, here's where
mm,
it's coming from. You know, once I like to go to a site. AI to projects to papers site where it actually talks about the different LLMs, the different AIs, and what they're built on. And yeah, it's boring. you know, I'm a bit of a geek. I like reading academic papers, but really, when you start reading some of that stuff, you're like, whoa. I did not realize that. You know, facial recognition, which is a big thing here in the States. When the first ones came out, I was reading the paper and they were like, you do realize that the database of images it's using, it comes from the 1970s.
mhm,
I didn't know that. Well, yeah, because of that. And then when you look at the individual pictures, you're like, there's not much diversity in these pictures. no, there isn't. So why do you think it has a 77% fail rate with women of a certain culture? because they don't have pictures of it. The computer can't do it. They can't recognize them. A few years ago, we had an incident where this isn't AI, but it shows you where our thinking. This is where diversity in AI, I think, really is important. But there was a story, and this actually happened to me. I was at the Atlanta airport here in the States. I went to the bathroom at the airport, and I went to wash my hands, and they had those sensor, the ones where you don't touch a
mhm.
knob, you just put your hand up in it. And I put my hand under, and no water came. I tried to use a soap, and no soap came. And I had another person that I was traveling with. I said, does this work for you? Because I went to like two or three of them, none of them worked. And it worked fine for him, right? And it wasn't until months later, I kind of didn't think about it. It wasn't until months later that I was reading an article. They said, yeah, when we programmed, it was programmed by a European company and there was no diversity. So they tested it themselves and it worked great. And then they deployed it and people bought it, but they didn't realize that the setting was just had to be brought down a little bit just so it can recognize different skin tones and all. Now that's a minor thing, but again, when I think about that story and I think about AI, I'm like, we got to be very careful how we implement this because now we're starting to talk about systems that are going to be able to do stuff with a little bit of input and they're going to be able to go through an entire line. How is that going to adversely affect somebody? And if we don't have diverse people in those projects, those questions aren't going to come up. If you were to, if an example I like to use, I lived in London for 3 years back in the 90s, great time.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know that if you were to talk about, if I was going to open up a tea shop in London, and I only talked to Americans about a tea shop, and I went to London and I opened up that tea shop, more than likely it's going to fail, right? It's going to fail
100%.
immediately, right?
100%.
Because that's Americans, we don't drink tea. We're not a big tea drinking country. So
Yeah.
therefore, there's going to be a problem there. And you would probably walk in there and say, hey man, Johnathan, why do you just call us over there? We could have told you these teas are never going to sell here.
Yeah.
Get us some PG tips and we're good.
Yeah.
You went and sourced these exotic teas and everything else. That's nice, but we don't buy that. And we're
That's
not
right.
going to pay that for that because I can go right down to the Tesco and get it, third the price.
That's
You
right.
know, over here though, yes, tea, you go to a tea shop, I had a British friend of mine, he actually says, you all pay this much for tea? I'm like, it's nice tea. It's like, it's like, well, you don't
Wow.
drink it that much, so I guess that's why you pay that much for it. But again, the same is true in anything. If you don't have that diverse thought, especially if you're looking at certain communities and they're
Mm,
not in on that process of developing it, you're going to fail tremendously. And unfortunately, when it comes to IT, it could not just be a failure of your business, it could just be a catastrophic incident
that's
that
right.
happens to a community or to an area.
That's right. Well, for what I thought was going to be a 15-minute chat, it has ended up being 70, which I really I think is brilliant.
That's
And it's the point of long form content is that I mean, I saw the Lex Friedman Donald Trump interview last week, and Lex does 3 hour, 4 hour. I think he did a 7 or 8 hour one recently. Trump was on and off within 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and I think the length of the podcast doesn't necessarily reflect the quality, but in this context, it certainly has. And so the places that we've explored on this would conjure future thought and potentially a future meeting of minds. And I'm starting to consider a group video call of 5 or 6 disparate, diverse people, you included, that should talk about some of these topics further. Um, of course, we do individually, but I think that part of my role has to be to bring forward a global collaboration as well. So that's happened. That thought has happened during our conversations. This is a new anyone who's watching this in a year's time go, oh, that's where it started. That's where this. So here's a bit of history happening. Johnathan, thank you so much for joining. And for those watching or listening, in the description, there's Jonathan's bio and a link to you as well on LinkedIn. And so I encourage everyone to explore what you do further. And thank you so much for being on this and brilliant conversation.
Thank you. It was a great conversation. I had a great time.
Excellent. Cheers.